The history of great civilizations is usually measured in colossal stones, in monuments that scratch the sky, and in borders traced with the red ink of human conflicts. But there exists a different chronicle, one that was not inscribed on the eternal granite of the pyramids, nor on the polished marble of the imperial palaces, but in an infinitely more delicate and paradoxically indestructible material: human memory. What few understand is that, long before the flames devoured their temple and the legions scattered their embers, this seed of resistance was already germinating in the desert of faith. But just when the ancient world seemed ready to engulf them, the question that has resonated for millennia arose: could the shadows of the past survive to haunt the future? The seed of faith. In the quicksands of time, where legends are interwoven with historical reality until they become indistinguishable, the figure of Abram emerges. He does not appear in the records as a king crowned with gold, nor as a victorious general commanding legions, but as a humble nomad whose obedience to an invisible frequency would forever alter the spiritual genetic code of humanity. His journey does not begin in a vacuum, but under the colossal shadow of the ziggurats of Mesopotamia in the great city of Ur of the Chaldees. To understand the magnitude of his departure, we must look at what he left behind. Ur was not a primitive settlement. It was the pinnacle of Sumerian civilization, a center of international trade and, above all, the heart of the cult to the lunar god Nana. Abram lived in a society obsessed with astrology and complex pantheons, where every aspect of life was governed by the whims of celestial deities. In this context, Abram's decision was a radical break with the consensual reality of his time. The dust of the Euphrates River adhered to his sandals as he crossed the waters, deliberately leaving behind the clay idols and the pagan temples. This massive migration of his clan was not driven by physical hunger nor by the desire for military conquest, but by an ethereal and almost impossible promise: the possession of an unknown land and a descent as numerous as the stars that studded the desert's night sky. Some modern theorists suggest that Abram's departure may have coincided with the collapse of the third dynasty of Ur, speculating that perhaps Abram possessed an astronomical or divine knowledge that warned him of the imminent fall of his civilization, acting as a preserver of a primordial monotheistic knowledge that had been lost among the multitude of gods. However, on those cold and starry nights, Abram, who would be renamed as Abraham under the divine covenant, faced trials that would have shattered any common soul. The first was the sterility of his wife Sarah, a biological silence that defied the logic of the promise. In other cultures of the time, such as the Babylonian one, the lack of descent was seen as a curse or a rejection by the gods, reason enough for repudiation. But Abraham maintained the weight. The supreme trial would arrive years later on Mount Moriah. The biblical narrative tells us that he was asked to give up the life of his son Isaac. This episode is crucial if we compare it with the neighbors of the Hebrews. In Canaan and Phoenicia, the cult to Moloch and to Baal routinely demanded that parents surrender their children to the fire to ensure harvests or military victories. Human sacrifice was an accepted economic and magical transaction. When Abraham raised the knife under the relentless light of noon, he was about to perform an act that his contemporaries would have understood perfectly. But then the unthinkable occurred. The metal was stopped by a celestial intervention. This moment was not only the physical salvation of Isaac, it was a theological revolution. It established a definitive border. This new God did not desire human death, but the consecration of the will. While the Aztecs millennia later would rip out hearts to feed the sun, and the Carthaginians would offer infants in times of siege, the faith of Abraham declared that human life was untouchable. Isaac, the son of the promise, fathered Jacob in a world marked by rivalries and fraternal deceptions. The story tells us of the theft of the birthright from his brother Esau by means of a steaming lentil stew and the deceptive touch of a goatskin. Here we see a recurrent pattern in this narrative, the choice of the younger son over the older one, something that broke with the laws of inheritance of almost all ancient cultures, from Egypt to China, where the firstborn was everything. This suggested that destiny was not in the blood, but in the choice. Jacob, a tireless fighter by nature, starred in one of the most mysterious events of antiquity. He faced an unknown being in absolute darkness alongside the banks of the Jabbok River. Traditional interpretations speak of an angel, but the text is ambiguous and disturbing. Jacob fights all night until dawn. Was it a physical manifestation of the divinity, an interdimensional traveler, or a fight against his own psychological shadow? From that nocturnal combat, he emerged limping, physically marked by the contact with the supernatural, but renamed as Israel, the one who struggles with God. His 12 children, who would be the founders of the tribes, became entangled in a network of toxic jealousy that culminated in the betrayal against their brother Joseph. They sold him to caravans of Ishmaelite merchants whose camels were loaded with spices and resins, sending him to Egypt as one more merchandise. But destiny is a complex machinery. Joseph, thanks to his prophetic dreams of bent spikes and dancing stars, ascended from the damp and dark dungeons, where hope seemed to have been extinguished, to the golden court of the pharaoh. Here the story aligns with a fascinating theory. Egyptologists speak of the period of the Hyksos, the shepherd kings of Semitic origin who governed the Lower Egypt for a time. It is very probable that Joseph's ascent occurred under one of these foreign dynasties, which would explain how a Hebrew shepherd could become vizier in a society as xenophobic and stratified as the Egyptian one. Joseph interpreted the visions of thin cows devouring the fat ones, implementing a grain storage system that saved the region. This ascent brought the Israelites to the Nile, where the initial refuge slowly transformed into invisible chains. The smell of lotus and papyrus of the palace was soon replaced by the bitter sweat of the Hebrews building storage cities under the whip. However, in the depths of this oppression, a divine spark was about to ignite. Just when servitude seemed eternal, a leader emerged from the shadows of the palace, but the desert that awaited them was not a path of immediate freedom, but a scenario of trials designed to purge the soul of a nascent nation. The Exodus, the War of the Gods, and the Machine of Sinai. Moses, the Prince of Egypt who concealed Hebrew blood in his veins, embodies the archetype of the hero who must lose everything to find himself. His origin story, saved from the waters in a basket of rushes, curiously resonates with the legend of Sargon of Akkad, the great Mesopotamian king, suggesting a universal pattern in ancient mythology about leaders destined for greatness. After taking the life of a cruel foreman in defense of a slave, he was forced to flee toward the vast desert of Midian. He spent decades shepherding sheep in the arid volcanic lands, under a relentless sun that burned his doubts and molded his character far from the luxuries of the court. His call to destiny was not with royal trumpets, but with a phenomenon that defied physics, a bush that burned with intense fire but was not consumed. The flames danced like living spirits on Mount Horeb. Here the divinity was revealed not as a tangible idol of stone or wood, common in all cultures of the moment, but as an absolute and abstract presence that declared, "I am that I am," an ontological definition that was millennia away from the philosophical understanding of the time. Moses returned to Egypt accompanied by Aaron to confront the most powerful man on earth, the Pharaoh, considered a living god. What followed was not only a political struggle, but a theological war. Each of the 10 plagues can be interpreted as a direct and calculated attack against a specific deity of the Egyptian pantheon. The Nile turned into blood was a humiliation for Hapi, the spirit of the river. The darkness that could be touched was a direct challenge to Ra, the sun god. Some scientists have tried to explain these events through the theory of the eruption of the Thera volcano in Santorini, which could have caused climatic changes, volcanic ash darkening the sky, and toxic red tides. However, the synchronization of the events suggests something beyond mere geological coincidence. The darkest night arrived with the 10th plague. The shadow of the end swept through the streets, taking the firstborn, from the heir to the throne to the prisoner's son, but passing over the houses marked with the blood of a lamb. This ritual would give birth to the Passover, a celebration of memory that contrasts with the rituals of oblivion in other cultures. The Exodus began with columns of fire guiding the crowd in the night, a phenomenon that some ufologists and ancient astronaut theorists have wanted to see as evidence of advanced aerial technology guiding the people, although the theological interpretation points to the manifested presence of the divinity, Shekinah. The crossing of the Red Sea remains one of the most debated points. While science speaks of descending winds capable of pushing the waters in shallow areas, the narrative describes walls of liquid water defying gravity, which collapsed upon the most advanced military technology of the Bronze Age, the Egyptian war chariots. But the desert is not a paradise, it is a crucible of transformation. Complaints soon began. The psychology of the slave is difficult to break. The people missed the food of Egypt despite the chains. They received the manna, a white substance that fell like morning dew. Theories about what the manna was abound, from insect excretions on tamarisk trees to edible lichens. However, there exists a wild theory stemming from esoteric interpretations of the Zohar, the manna machine, which suggests that the Ark of the Covenant and the food supply could have been the product of a lost or delivered technology capable of synthesizing food from the air, an idea that borders on science fiction but that fascinates seekers of mysteries. At the foot of Sinai, the earth trembled. Thunders rumbled and lightning illuminated a smoking mountain. The delivery of the 10 Commandments on tables of stone was a singular moment in legal history. While the Code of Hammurabi protected property and social classes, the Mosaic Law introduced radical innovations: the intrinsic value of human life, the prohibition of internal greed, not only external theft, and the concept of the sabbatical rest. The Sabbath was revolutionary. In no other ancient culture was rest granted to servants and even to beasts of burden. It was a declaration of universal dignity. It was there where human fragility was also seen. Impatience in the absence of Moses led to the creation of a molten gold calf. This act was not a simple whim, it was a regression. The calf probably represented Apis or Hathor, Egyptian gods of fertility and strength. The people, terrified by the freedom and the silence of the desert, sought refuge in the tangible, in what they could see and touch, rejecting the invisible God who had freed them. The construction of the tabernacle, and specifically of the Ark of the Covenant, introduces another technical mystery. The instructions given to Moses were extremely precise, detailing materials that are conductors and insulators, gold and acacia wood. Some electrical engineers have pointed out that the design of the Ark functionally resembles a giant electrical capacitor capable of storing massive charges of static electricity from the dry desert environment. Would this explain why no one could touch the Ark without instantly losing their life, struck down by a discharge? Was the Ark a communication device, a weapon, or simply a sacred object whose sanctity was incompatible with human impurity? 40 years of wandering were necessary for the slave-minded generation to disappear, making way for a new identity forged in the ethic of the law and not in the fear of the whip. Canaan waited on the other side, but with cities fortified up to the sky and warriors, the Anakim, who were described as giants before whom the Hebrew spies felt like locusts. On the edge of the Promised Land, the people were divided between panic and faith, just when a new leader had to emerge for the imminent battle. The transition from Moses to Joshua would mark the end of the era of atmospheric miracles and the beginning of the era of the sword and territorial conquest. The conquest of Canaan and the era of the judges. History does not always advance with the slow pace of caravans. Sometimes it strikes with the force of a war hammer. After decades of wandering through the desert, the transformation of the Hebrew tribes from wandering nomads to military conquerors is one of the most abrupt and fascinating turns of antiquity. We are not talking simply about a migration driven by necessity, but about a calculated invasion that challenged all military logic known in the Bronze Age. Joshua, the designated successor, was not a dreamy mystic like his predecessor, but a pragmatic strategist who understood that faith must be accompanied by tactics. His first maneuver was the crossing of the Jordan River, an event described in the Chronicles as an impossible hydrological event where the waters stopped and rose in a solid wall upstream, allowing an entire nation to pass over dry ground. This is where modern theorists and geologists enter a fascinating debate, for some suggest that a massive landslide near the city of Adam, caused by the frequent seismic activity in the Rift Valley, could have temporarily blocked the flow of the river. It would not be the only time in the geological history of the region. Earthquakes recorded in 1927 caused a similar phenomenon, stopping the water for hours. But for the ancient Israelites, this was neither geology nor chance. It was a declaration of cosmic authority, an unequivocal sign that the laws of nature were subordinate to their mission of conquest. Once on dry land, the first great test they faced was Jericho, one of the oldest inhabited cities in the world, a fortress surrounded by double walls that seemed impenetrable for an army without heavy machinery. The strategy employed here baffles traditional military historians because it defies every manual of war of the time. There were no siege machines, no earthen ramps, no battering rams hitting the doors. It was an operation of psychological warfare and perhaps something more mysterious that bordered on the technological. For 6 days, the army marched in absolute silence around the city, an unnatural silence that must have been terrifying for the inhabitants watching from the walls, awaiting an attack that did not arrive. Only the rhythmic sound of 7 trumpets of ram's horn was heard. The 7th day, the silence was broken with a unified shout from thousands of throats and the coordinated blast of the trumpets, a moment in which the walls collapsed outwards, allowing the invaders to climb directly. Here emerges one of the wildest and most debated theories: acoustic resonance. Modern engineers have speculated whether a specific frequency, amplified by the geography of the valley and the acoustics of the horns played in unison, could have found the resonance frequency of the adobe and stone walls, causing a structural liquefaction. Did the ancient priests know secrets about sound and vibration that modern engineering is only just rediscovering? If we look at other cultures, we find disturbingly similar myths. In Greek mythology, for example, it is said that Amphion built the walls of Thebes by moving the heavy stones only with the sound of his lyre, which suggests the existence of a lost global tradition about a sonic technology capable of building or destroying. The campaign continued with a brutal intensity until reaching the Battle of Gibeon, where the most discussed and controversial astronomical event in the Bible occurs. Joshua orders the sun and the moon to stop in the sky to extend the daylight and complete his victory. Interpretations of this event vary from the purely poetic to catastrophic scenarios. Some astrophysicists suggest that it could have been a total solar eclipse that suddenly lowered the temperature, causing panic, or an unusual atmospheric refraction. However, bolder theorists, following the lines of thought of researchers like Immanuel Velikovsky, propose that a planetary approach, perhaps Venus or Mars passing dangerously close to Earth, could have temporarily altered the planet's rotation or tilted its axis, creating the optical and physical illusion of a prolonged day. Curiously, on the other side of the world, the annals of pre-Columbian cultures in the Andes and ancient records in China speak of a long day or a long night that occurred in a chronologically similar era. Was it a global phenomenon that each culture interpreted in its own way according to its own myths? The coincidence is, to say the least, suspicious and points to a cataclysmic event forgotten by conventional history. Despite these supernatural victories, peace in Canaan was as fragile as glass, and the real threat to the tribes did not come from the desert but from the sea. The Philistines, part of the mysterious sea peoples, who had devastated the eastern Mediterranean, causing the collapse of entire civilizations such as the Hittites and weakening Egypt, began to press from the coast. To understand the existential danger they represented, we must look at the technology. While the Israelites were still trapped in the Bronze Age, the Philistines possessed the secret of iron smelting. They were elite warriors with heavy armor and reinforced war chariots that, for the tribes of the hills armed with bronze and leather, were equivalent to facing modern tanks with hunting rifles. This technological disparity plunged the region into chaos, and without a central government, the tribes operated as Greek city-states, often fighting among themselves. In times of extreme crisis, when extinction seemed imminent, the figure of the judge arose. It is vital to clarify that they were not magistrates with robes in orderly courts. They were warlords, resistance leaders, and charismatic chieftains, often marginal and deeply flawed figures who were possessed by a spirit of leadership to save their people. One of these figures, Deborah, breaks all the molds of antiquity by being established as the supreme political and judicial authority in a deeply patriarchal society, dispatching orders under a palm tree. Her general, Barak, refused to go to battle without her, a tacit recognition that her strategic power came from a divine or intuitive connection that he did not possess. The victory they orchestrated against the Canaanite general Sisera was not a duel of brute force, but a master trap utilizing the muddy terrain of the Kishon torrent to render the technological advantage of the enemy's iron chariots useless. The end of Sisera is worthy of a psychological horror film. Fleeing the battlefield, he sought refuge in the tent of Jael, a woman who feigned hospitality. While he slept exhausted, she took a tent peg and with a chilling efficiency ended his life. This act resonates with stories from other cultures where the female figure becomes the final executor of destiny, such as the Moirai or Clytemnestra in Greece or the Norse Valkyries. Jael did not use a warrior's sword but a domestic tool, subverting the expectations of traditional warfare and demonstrating that in this conflict no one was safe. Then Gideon arose, who represents the archetype of the reluctant hero and full of doubts, needing constant empirical proof before acting. His campaign against the Midianites is a manual of modern special operations. Instead of a massive army that would be difficult to coordinate, he selected only 300 elite men. The tactic was pure psychological warfare. They attacked at night, breaking clay pitchers that concealed torches and sounding trumpets simultaneously from different points. The visual and sound effect in the absolute darkness led the immense enemy army to believe they were surrounded by an infinitely superior force. Panic seized the camp, and in the confusion the enemies began to attack each other, a tactic of deception that recalls the strategies of Sun Tzu, who stated that all warfare is based on deception, or the Spartan defense at Thermopylae, where terrain and fear were worth more than numbers. But of all these leaders, the figure who most captures the popular imagination is Samson, a man impossible to ignore. It is difficult to read his story without thinking of the great solar heroes of comparative mythology, such as the Greek Hercules or the Sumerian Gilgamesh. Samson was a Nazarite, consecrated from the womb with a strict prohibition from cutting his hair or touching the fruit of the vine. His strength was not muscular in the anatomical sense. He was not necessarily a bodybuilder giant, but supernatural. He ripped a lion apart with his bare hands, a feat identical to that of Hercules with the Nemean lion, and eliminated 1,000 men using only a donkey's jawbone. However, Samson is also the tragedy of impulse and lack of control. He was emotionally volatile, addicted to danger and to the women of the enemy side, which led to his ruin. His relationship with Delilah is the first great espionage drama in history. She was not simply a lover, but an operative agent paid by the Philistine lords to discover the source of his biological technology. When his secret was revealed and his hair cut, he lost his connection to the source of his power. Some theorists speculate about the nature of this force. Was it a unique genetic mutation? Or was the hair a metaphor for something more, perhaps a kind of antenna or bioelectrical connection that, when cut, interrupted the flow of energy? Blinded and chained, reduced to a beast of burden, Samson stars in one of the most dramatic endings in ancient literature by pulling down the Temple of Dagon upon himself and his captors, an act of total sacrifice that marked the end of an era. The chaos of the age of the judges led the people to an inevitable conclusion. Absolute tribal freedom was dangerous, and they wanted a king, a centralized state like the neighboring nations, willing to exchange their freedom for security. The United Kingdom and the Golden Age. The transition from a tribal confederation to a centralized monarchy was not a smooth political process, it was a national trauma. The prophet Samuel warned severely that a king would take their sons for war, their daughters for service, and their best lands for his courtiers. But the collective fear of the Philistines and internal disorder was greater than the fear of future tyranny. The first king, Saul, seemed the perfect candidate taken from a royal casting, tall, imposing, from the warrior tribe of Benjamin. But his reign quickly became a psychiatric case study on power and madness. Saul started well, unifying scattered factions, but soon descended into deep paranoia, suffering episodes of severe melancholy and irrational fury. Today, many historical psychologists who analyze the texts suggest that Saul might have suffered from bipolar disorder or severe clinical depression, exacerbated by the immense pressure of leadership and the feeling of spiritual abandonment. His disobedience in ritual matters cost him the divine favor, creating a power vacuum where an unexpected figure would arise. Into this unstable scenario enters David, a young shepherd from Bethlehem, whose confrontation in the valley of Elah against Goliath has become the universal metaphor of the underdog versus the giant. But if we analyze the scene with forensic and ballistic eyes, we see something distinct from the childlike version. Goliath is described as a giant, a champion armored with bronze scales, whose description medically coincides with acromegaly or pituitary gigantism. Great stature and strength, but often accompanied by vision problems and slow movement, which is why he needed a shield-bearer to guide him. Here enter the theories about the lineages of giants. Was Goliath a remnant descendant of the Anakim or Nephilim, those hybrid beings mentioned in ancient texts of the region? David, on the other hand, was not carrying a toy. The sling was a lethal weapon of war in the ancient world. The slingers from the Balearic Islands or Rhodes were as feared as elite archers. A smooth stone projectile launched at high speed has the stopping power and kinetic energy of a low-caliber bullet. David did not win by luck or magic, but by tactical superiority. He rejected the heavy armor that would have slowed him down and used a high-precision, long-range attack against heavy static infantry. The impact on Goliath's forehead was a sniper shot that sent a psychological shockwave capable of demoralizing the Philistine army. However, David's fame became his immediate curse, for Saul's pathological jealousy forced him to flee to the desert. For years, the future king lived as an outlaw, a warlord in the Robin Hood style, leading a group of indebted and discontented men in the caves of Adullam, forging his character in extreme survival and not in the comfort of the palace. After Saul's tragic end on Mount Gilboa, where the first king preferred to take his own life rather than be captured and tortured by the enemy, David ascended to the throne and performed his master move, the conquest of Jerusalem. This city was a Jebusite fortress considered impregnable, and David did not take it by frontal assault, but through cunning. His men infiltrated through the Tsinor, or water channel, climbing up from inside. This tunnel, identified by archaeologists as Warren's shaft system, suggests an advanced knowledge of the city's hydraulic engineering. By establishing Jerusalem as the capital, David chose a neutral place that did not belong to any of the 12 tribes, avoiding internal jealousies, and moved the Ark of the Covenant there, making the city the undisputed political and religious center. David's reign expanded the borders to the Euphrates River, establishing a regional empire, but history does not conceal his personal shadows. The incident with Bathsheba is a crude tale of abuse of power. The king, staying in the palace while his troops fought, took what he wanted simply because he could. And when Bathsheba's pregnancy threatened a scandal, David orchestrated a conspiracy to eliminate her husband, Uriah the Hittite, sending him to his death on the battlefront. It was an assassination by administrative decree, an act that brought devastating consequences for his own family, unleashing a series of tragedies, rebellions, and palace intrigues that marked his final years. His son Solomon inherited the throne after a bloody purge of political rivals, marking the shift from the era of military conquest to the era of commercial diplomacy and monumental construction. The pinnacle project was the first temple, an architectural marvel that consumed tons of gold and cedar of Lebanon. Here arises a fascinating and wild theory extracted from the Talmudic legends about the construction of the temple, the use of the shamir. Tradition says that since it was forbidden to use iron tools, instruments of war, to carve the sacred stones of the altar, Solomon used a device or creature called shamir that could cut stone with laser precision and without friction. Was the shamir a lost ancient technology, perhaps a form of concentrated energy or radiation, that allowed rock to be worked in ways we do not understand today? Ancient astronaut theorists suggest that this could be evidence of high-tech tools misinterpreted by ancient scribes who described them as worms or living beings. Furthermore, Solomon's wealth is legendary. His fleet sailed to mysterious places like Tarshish and Ophir, returning every 3 years loaded with gold, ivory, and exotic animals. The location of Ophir remains one of the great archaeological mysteries. Was it in Africa, in India, or, as some very controversial theories suggest, did his ships reach the Americas, bringing resources from the New World centuries before Columbus? The visit of the Queen of Sheba was not just a cultural exchange, but a high-level commercial summit that cemented Israel's position as the commercial nexus between East and West. But there is an aspect of Solomon that esoteric tradition amplifies much more than the official biblical text, his facet as a magician and master of natural mysteries. Later texts present him controlling spiritual forces and demons to force them to build the temple, possessing a ring with the divine seal that gave him dominion over the invisible world. These stories reflect the impression his wisdom left, a knowledge so vast that it seemed supernatural. However, this golden age had feet of clay, for the maintenance of such splendor required brutal taxes and forced labor that sowed resentment. Upon his death, the arrogance of his son Rehoboam broke the nation in two. By refusing to ease the burden of the people, he provoked the separation of the northern tribes, dividing the great empire into two rival kingdoms, Israel and Judah, leaving them vulnerable to predatory empires like Assyria and Babylon that watched from the horizon, ready to devour what was left of the concrete and gold utopia that had cost so much blood to build. The division and the fall of the North. The history of nations is often decided not on the battlefield, but in the dark corridors of the human mind, where paranoia and ambition weave their nets. After the death of Solomon, the unified kingdom of Israel did not collapse due to an external attack, but due to an internal implosion. What happened was a geopolitical fracture that changed the destiny of the Middle East forever. Jeroboam, a labor leader turned revolutionary, capitalized on popular discontent over high taxes and led the 10 northern tribes toward secession. But Jeroboam had a logistical problem that soon became a theological obsession. Jerusalem, the spiritual center, was in the south, in enemy territory. He feared that if his people crossed the border to worship, their political loyalty would return to the house of David. To stop this brain and soul drain, Jeroboam performed an audacious and dangerous social engineering maneuver. He erected 2 golden calves, one in Bethel and the other in Dan. Here is where historians and theologians stop to compare cultures. This bovine worship was not new. It resonated deeply with the cult to Apis in Egypt, where the bull represented strength and divine virility, or with the Canaanite god El, often associated with the bull. By doing this, Jeroboam was not only creating a political schism, but he was reintroducing a religious syncretism that linked Israel with the surrounding pagan powers. He established an illegitimate priesthood, allowing anyone with money to buy the position, democratizing the sacred until corrupting it completely. The north, now called the Kingdom of Israel, was prosperous and cosmopolitan, controlling vital trade routes, but its throne was an ejector seat. Kings came and went through conspiracies and selective eliminations. The spiritual darkness reached its zenith with the arrival of Ahab and his wife Jezebel. This is not just a story of a bad king, it is the clash of 2 civilizations. Jezebel, a Phoenician princess from Sidon, brought with her a sophisticated and aggressive religious machinery dedicated to Baal and Ashtoreth. Baal, the god of storms and fertility, demanded rituals that often involved extreme physical acts and human offerings, something that horrified the Yahwist prophets. It was in this vortex of corruption where Elijah arose, a figure who seems carved from granite. The confrontation on Mount Carmel is perhaps one of the most dramatic duels of antiquity. It was not just a theological discussion, it was a test of empirical power. Elijah challenged the prophets of Baal for their God to light the sacrificial fire. While the priests of Baal screamed and lacerated their skin in an ecstatic frenzy, a common practice in Anatolian cults to awaken the sleeping gods, there was no response. When it was Elijah's turn, he soaked his altar with water to eliminate any possibility of pyrotechnic tricks. Here is where the wildest theories enter. The text says that fire fell from the sky and consumed not only the sacrifice but the stones and the water. Skeptics speak of an opportune lightning strike in an area prone to thunderstorms. However, ancient astronaut theorists suggest that the description of a surgical and devastating fire resembles directed energy technologies or interventions by non-human intelligences that watched over the development of this specific tribe. Whether a divine miracle or a misunderstood technological intervention, the result was the total elimination of the priests of Baal in the Kishon Brook. While the north struggled in this mystical and political chaos, a shadow lengthened from the east. The Assyrian Empire was awakening. If we compare the Assyrians with other powers of antiquity, they were the ultimate war machine, the Spartans of Mesopotamia, but with an industrialized cruelty. Their stone reliefs proudly show what they did to the cities that resisted, mass flayings and impalements designed for psychological terror. They did not hide their brutality, they publicized it as foreign policy. Under the command of Tiglath-Pileser and then Shalmaneser, the noose closed around Samaria, the capital of the north. The siege lasted 3 years, a time in which desperation led the inhabitants to limit situations that history prefers not to detail. Finally, in the year 722 before the Common Era, Sargon II completed the conquest. But the Assyrians had a different strategy than simple occupation: denaturalization. They did not want rebellious subjects, they wanted to erase identities. Mass deportations began. Thousands of Israelites were bound and forced to march hundreds of kilometers toward the heart of Assyria and the cities of the Medes. And here occurs one of the greatest mysteries of anthropology and history: the 10 lost tribes. Unlike the south, which would maintain its identity, the northern tribes seemed to dissolve into the fog of history. But did they really disappear? Theories about their destiny are fascinating and span the entire globe. Some trace their lineage to the Pashtuns in Afghanistan and Pakistan, who have tribal codes, the Pashtunwali, that strangely reflect Mosaic laws and whose clan names sound disturbingly similar to the biblical tribes. Others look toward the east, toward Japan. There is a controversial but persistent theory that suggests that certain Shinto rituals and the structure of the portable shrines, or mikoshi, have inexplicable parallels with the Ark of the Covenant and Levitical practices, suggesting that a migration reached the islands of the rising sun through the Silk Road. There are even theories that cross the ocean. Since the 17th century, explorers and theologians have speculated that some groups of Native Americans could be descendants of these tribes, based on supposed linguistic and cultural similarities, an idea that would later be fundamental for religious movements like Mormonism. In Africa, the Lemba people of Zimbabwe have maintained Jewish traditions for millennia, and modern genetic analyses have found in their priests the Y chromosome haplogroup known as the Cohen gene, linking them directly with the ancient Semitic priestly lineage. It is as if the north of Israel had not been destroyed, but fragmented and sown across the entire planet, waiting to be rediscovered. While the north disappeared, the kingdom of Judah in the south watched with terror. Sennacherib, the Assyrian king, directed his machinery toward Jerusalem. The Assyrian records, specifically the Taylor Prism, boast of having locked King Hezekiah like a bird in a cage, but curiously, they never claim to have taken the city. The Bible speaks of an angel who eliminated 185,000 soldiers in one night. The Greek historian Herodotus offers a different but equally strange version, a plague of field mice that devoured the bowstrings and shields of the Assyrians, leaving them defenseless. Was it a swift disease, a divine intervention, or a biological anomaly? Judah survived, but only for a time. A new alpha predator, Babylon, was devouring Assyria and would soon set its eyes on the Golden City. The Babylonian exile and the return. The fall of Jerusalem in the year 586 before the Common Era was not only a military defeat, it was a theological extinction event that, paradoxically, gave birth to modern Judaism. Nebuchadnezzar II, a builder and conqueror king whose ambition bordered on megalomania, finally broke the city's defenses after a siege that reduced the population to absolute famine. The brutality of the Babylonian conquest was surgical. King Zedekiah tried to flee through underground tunnels, systems that today archaeologists continue to discover under the old city, but was captured. His punishment was designed to be the last image his brain processed. He witnessed the end of his children before his eyes were put out. Solomon's Temple, an architectural wonder of the ancient world clad in cedar and gold, was set on fire. And here arises the greatest mystery of all. What happened to the Ark of the Covenant? The Bible does not mention its capture among the booty taken to Babylon. The lists of looted treasures are meticulous, but the Ark is not among them. This has fueled centuries of speculation. One theory suggests that the prophet Jeremiah hid it in a cavern on Mount Nebo, sealing the entrance until the end of time. Another theory, popularized by the Ethiopian dynasty, claims that it was taken to the south, to Aksum, where it supposedly resides today under the watch of a monk who never leaves the enclosure. There are bolder hypotheses that connect the Ark with the Knights Templar centuries later, suggesting that they found it excavating under the Temple Mount, and that its immense power or technological knowledge was the source of their sudden wealth. Some theoretical physicists, analyzing the biblical descriptions of the Ark, wooden box covered with gold, insulator and conductor, suggest that it functioned as a giant electrical capacitor capable of storing massive static electricity, or even as a radio frequency communication device with an unknown power source. Whatever the truth, the Ark disappeared from the narrative, leaving a void in the most holy place. The Jews were taken to Babylon, but not to prison camps, but to one of the most advanced metropolises on earth. Babylon was a city of blue-glazed bricks and hanging gardens that defied gravity. Here, in front of the immense ziggurats that recalled the Tower of Babel, the exiles suffered a massive cultural shock. They were surrounded by advanced astronomy, mathematics, and a rich mythology of gods like Marduk. The temptation to assimilate was immense. Without a temple and without land, how could they continue to be the chosen people? The answer was an intellectual revolution. If they could not offer sacrifices, they would offer words. The synagogue was born in exile as a radical concept, a portable sanctuary made of community and study, not of stones. The scribes began to codify the oral traditions at a frantic pace, fearing they would be lost. It was on the banks of the Tigris and Euphrates rivers where much of the Hebrew Bible took its final written form, edited to respond to the catastrophe of the exile. In this environment, visionary figures emerged. Ezekiel, an exiled priest, described visions that today are the fundamental pillar of the ancient astronaut theory. His description of wheels within wheels, living beings with multiple faces, and a flying throne that moved with the sound of many waters, is interpreted by some not as a mystical theophany, but as the detailed citing of a technological craft by someone who lacked the technical vocabulary to describe it. For Ezekiel, the glory of God was no longer tied to Jerusalem. It was mobile, universal, and cosmic. Daniel, on the other hand, operated in the high spheres of Babylonian power. His ability to interpret dreams and inexplicable phenomena, such as the ghostly writing on the wall during Belshazzar's feast, kept him alive in a court full of intrigues and rival magicians. Some scholars see parallels in Daniel's stories with the legends of the Assyrian and Babylonian court, suggesting that he became a master of Chaldean wisdom without compromising his identity. History took a cinematographic turn with the fall of Babylon. The impregnable city fell in a single night to the Persians, who diverted the Euphrates River to march through its dry bed beneath the walls while the city celebrated a party. Cyrus the Great emerged as the new master of the world. Cyrus is an anomaly in ancient history, a conqueror who practiced religious tolerance, influenced perhaps by Zoroastrianism, which shared dualistic concepts of good and evil. Cyrus saw in the God of the Jews a force that deserved respect. His Cyrus cylinder is considered by many as the first declaration of human rights. In the year 539, he issued the decree of return. But the journey home was not the triumphant parade that many expected. Only a remnant returned to a ruined Jerusalem, inhabited by wild animals and hostile peoples who had occupied the power vacuum. The reconstruction of the temple under Zerubbabel was a bittersweet task. The elders who remembered Solomon's temple openly wept because the new building seemed insignificant in comparison. Furthermore, the tangible divine presence was missing. The most holy place was empty. Ezra and Nehemiah arrived later to consolidate the society and the physical defenses. Nehemiah, cupbearer to the Persian king, was a pragmatic administrator who organized the construction of the wall with military efficiency. The masons worked with the trowel in one hand and the sword in the other. They had to purify the community, expelling foreign wives and re-establishing a strict identity, a harsh measure designed to prevent the cultural dissolution that had condemned the north. Judea was reborn, but it was a small province in a vast Persian empire, vulnerable and surrounded. And although they enjoyed relative peace in the west, in the mountains of Macedonia, a young prince was being educated by Aristotle, preparing to unleash a storm that would erase the map of the ancient world. The Hellenistic threat and the light of Hanukkah. When Alexander the Great crossed the Hellespont, he did not just bring an army, he brought an idea. Hellenism was not just a culture, it was an aggressively attractive worldview that exalted the human body, philosophical reason, and aesthetics. In the year 332, Alexander arrived at the gates of Jerusalem. Jewish legends, recorded by Flavius Josephus, recount a fascinating encounter. The high priest went out to receive him dressed in his sacred robes. Alexander, who supposedly had seen this man in a dream before leaving Macedonia, prostrated before him, not worshipping the man, but the God he represented. It is said that they showed him the prophecies of Daniel that predicted his victory over Persia, which guaranteed a favorable treatment for the Jews. But Alexander died young, possibly poisoned or a victim of typhoid fever, and his empire fragmented among his generals, the Diadochi. Judea became the buffer state, the perpetual battlefield between the Ptolemies of Egypt and the Seleucids of Syria. During this time, a silent battle began to be fought, not with swords, but with lifestyles. Jerusalem began to transform. Greek gymnasiums were built in the shadow of the temple. The gymnasium was the center of Greek social life, where men exercised naked. For Jewish sensibility, this was a scandal, but for the young Jewish aristocrats who wanted to ascend socially, it was the place to be. The pressure to fit in was so strong that some underwent an unbearably painful and dangerous surgical operation called epispasm to cosmetically reverse their circumcision and avoid ridicule in public baths. The society fractured between the Hellenists, who embraced globalist modernity, and the traditionalists, who saw this as a spiritual betrayal. The latent tension exploded with the ascent of Antiochus IV Epiphanes to the Seleucid throne. Antiochus was not a normal ruler. His contemporaries often called him Epimanes, the madman, behind his back due to his erratic behavior and extreme narcissism. He decided that cultural diversity was a weakness for his kingdom and decreed a forced uniformity. He prohibited the observance of the Sabbath, circumcision, and dietary laws. The final act of provocation was a calculated desecration to break the Jewish spirit. Antiochus erected a statue of Zeus, probably with his own face, in the Temple of Jerusalem and sacrificed a pig on the altar. Pork meat was the definitive anathema for the Jews. It was a psychological and spiritual violation. Greek officials traveled through the towns, forcing local leaders to perform pagan sacrifices as proof of loyalty. In the village of Modiin, an old priest named Mattathias refused. When a Hellenized Jew stepped forward to comply with the order, Mattathias, possessed by an ancestral zeal, eliminated both the traitor and the Greek official. That sword blow started the Maccabean revolt. Mattathias and his 5 sons fled to the hills, starting a classic guerrilla war. Judas Maccabeus, son of Mattathias, proved to be one of the greatest tactical geniuses in military history. With an army of poorly equipped farmers, he faced the professional Syrian phalanxes. Judas understood that he could not win in open country, so he used the geography of Judea to his advantage. He attacked in narrow passes at night, using speed and knowledge of the terrain to neutralize the enemy's numerical superiority. His tactics are studied today as perfect examples of asymmetric warfare. The Battle of Beth Zechariah introduced an element of terror worthy of a monster movie: war elephants. The Greeks brought these armored beasts, intoxicated with wine and blackberry juice, to enrage them, carrying towers with archers on their backs. For the Jews, who had never seen such creatures, they must have seemed like prehistoric monsters. In an act of incredible bravery, Eleazar, brother of Judas, ran under an elephant, stabbing it from below, being crushed when the beast fell on him. It was a sacrifice that demonstrated that the fear of death had disappeared among the rebels. Finally, in the year 164, the Maccabees achieved the impossible. They retook Jerusalem. They found the temple in a desolate state, with plants growing in the courtyards and the sacred chambers converted into brothels or warehouses. They began the process of ritual cleansing. According to the Talmud, upon wanting to relight the menorah, the 7-branched candelabrum that symbolized the divine presence and wisdom, they only found 1 small jar of oil with the high priest's seal intact. It was barely enough for 1 day. Here, history blends with legend. That small amount of fuel burned inexplicably for 8 days, defying the laws of physics and combustion, until new consecrated oil could be produced. Some theorists suggest that perhaps they discovered a hidden reserve or an unknown slow-burning substance. But for the people, it was the unmistakable sign that heaven approved of their struggle. Thus was born Hanukkah, the festival of lights, celebrating the resistance of light against forced darkness. The Maccabees founded the Hasmonean dynasty, achieving a political independence that Israel had not seen in centuries. They expanded the borders and forced conversions, a historical irony considering their origin. But power corrupts. Over time, the descendants of the heroes became Hellenized kings, cruel and paranoid, fighting among themselves. Society was divided again, this time between Pharisees and Sadducees. In the midst of a civil war between 2 Hasmonean brothers for the throne, they committed the definitive strategic error. They invited a foreign superpower to arbitrate their dispute. Rome, which had been observing from the horizon like a patient wolf, accepted the invitation. General Pompey the Great arrived not as a mediator, but as a conqueror. In the year 63 before the Common Era, Pompey entered Jerusalem and, driven by curiosity, drew aside the veil and entered the most holy place. He left confused, for he found no statue, only an empty space. He could not understand an invisible God. Rome had come to stay, and its iron shadow would be much longer and more terrible than any previous empire, setting the stage for the most momentous event that the region and the world would ever see. Rome and the birth of the diaspora. Under Roman rule, the figure of Herod the Great rose to power, a megalomaniacal builder and a paranoid king who did not hesitate to eliminate his own family to secure his throne. Herod remodeled the temple, converting it into one of the wonders of the ancient world, with immense esplanades and gigantic retaining walls that still astound engineers today. It was a time of great messianic tension, where preachers traveled Galilee and Judea. Among them, Jesus of Nazareth, whose life and execution under the procurator Pontius Pilate would give birth to a new faith that would eventually separate from Judaism. The Roman oppression, the taxes and the religious insensitivity of the governors provoked the Great Revolt in the year 66. The rebels, known as zealots, managed to temporarily expel the Romans, but the empire's response was relentless. General Vespasian and his son Titus marched with legions determined to crush the rebellion. Jerusalem was besieged. The hunger within the walls led to situations of indescribable horror. Finally, in the year 70, the defenses fell, the temple was set on fire, and the gold melted, running down between the stones. The Arch of Titus in Rome still shows the looted treasures, including the menorah being carried in triumph. The final resistance took place in the fortress of Masada, where a group of rebels resisted for years until, seeing capture inevitable, they opted for a tragic and dignified end by their own hand, rather than submitting to slavery. Years later, a second revolt led by Bar Kokhba tried to regain independence, but it was crushed with such brutality by the Emperor Hadrian that Judea was depopulated and renamed as Palestine to erase the Jewish link with the land. However, before the final fall, a rabbi named Yohanan ben Zakkai managed to leave Jerusalem hidden in a coffin and obtained permission to found a school in Yavne. There, the sages realized that to survive without land and without a temple, they had to build a portable homeland made of laws and studies. The Talmud began to take shape, preserving the identity of the people in exile. Thus began the long night of the diaspora, navigating between tolerance and persecution under the cross and the crescent. The long medieval night and the expulsions. With Christianity converted into the official religion of Rome and the subsequent rise of Islam, Jews found themselves living as minorities in foreign lands. In the Islamic world, under the condition of dhimmi or protected people, they lived periods of relative prosperity and cultural collaboration. The Golden Age in Sepharad Muslim Spain saw cities like Cordoba become intellectual beacons of light. Maimonides, physician and philosopher, wrote works that reconciled faith with Aristotelian reason, while poets like Ibn Gabirol wrote sublime verses in Hebrew. But in Christian Europe, the situation was much more precarious. The Crusades, begun in the century 11 with the objective of freeing the Holy Land, started with massacres of Jewish communities in the Rhine Valley. False and grotesque accusations, such as the blood libel, which claimed that Jews used Christian blood for their rituals, provoked violence and distrust. In the century 13, England expelled its entire Jewish population, followed by France. In Spain, the atmosphere changed drastically in 1391 with waves of violence that forced mass conversions. The Inquisition was established to persecute those converts who practiced their faith in secret, the so-called Marranos, in dark basements and under the constant terror of denunciation. The year 1492 is famous for Columbus's voyage, but it also marks the expulsion of the Jews from Spain by the Catholic monarchs. Hundreds of thousands had to abandon the land they had called home for centuries, carrying with them the keys to their houses, keys that many families would preserve for generations as a symbol of an impossible return. Many found refuge in the Ottoman Empire, others in North Africa and Europe. In Italy, the first ghetto was established in Venice, a closed neighborhood where Jews were confined at night. Despite the segregation, culture flourished in adversity. In Eastern Europe, the shtetls or Jewish villages became centers of traditional life, where mystical movements like Hasidism would bring joy and spirituality to a life marked by poverty and the constant threat of the Cossacks. The hope of redemption never faded, but modernity would bring new challenges, the promise of equality and the nightmare of racialized hatred. The arrival of the Enlightenment and the French Revolution tore down the ghetto walls. Napoleon offered citizenship in exchange for integration. Jews entered universities, arts and sciences, contributing disproportionately to the progress of European nations. But this success generated a new kind of hatred. modern anti-Semitism, not based on religion, but on pseudo-scientific racial theories. The Dreyfus affair in France convinced a journalist named Theodor Herzl that the only safe solution was a state of their own, giving birth to political Zionism. Then the absolute darkness arrived. The rise of Nazism in Germany transformed hatred into an industry of death. The Nuremberg laws stripped Jews of their legal humanity, and the Night of Broken Glass marked the beginning of the end. The Holocaust was not an explosion of medieval anger, but a mechanized and bureaucratic extermination. Cattle cars transported millions toward camps designed for efficient annihilation. 6 million lives were silenced in gas chambers and their bodies converted into smoke and ash, erasing entire communities that had existed for millennia. The world, upon discovering the magnitude of the horror, was left speechless. But from the deepest and darkest ashes of history emerged the most improbable and astonishing rebirth. In May of 1948, barely 3 years after the world saw the gates of the extermination camps open, the voice of David Ben-Gurion resonated to declare the independence of the State of Israel. It was not only a political act, but an affirmation of existence. The nation, immediately attacked in its cradle by all its neighbors, not only resisted, it survived against all military and logistical odds, transforming refugees into defenders of their own sovereignty. The land itself experienced a metamorphosis. The sterile sands of the desert, dormant for centuries, flourished thanks to innovative agriculture that defied the climate. Even more miraculous was the rebirth of Hebrew, an ancient language reserved for millennia solely for sacred prayer, revived to become the everyday language of the streets, uniting a fragmented diaspora under one voice. Israel consolidated itself as a vital refuge and a global technological power, leading advancements from medicine to cybersecurity. However, peace remained an elusive horizon. The history of the country has been marked by defensive wars and continuous conflicts that have demanded eternal vigilance. The 7th of October of 2023, a brutal attack reopened old traumatic wounds in the collective psyche, a painful reminder that security is fragile and the price of freedom is high. Nonetheless, the history of this people transcends mere survival. It is a story of unshakable purpose. It is the narrative of a candle that stubbornly refuses to be extinguished by the hurricane of history, of a memory that insists on remembering so that humanity does not lose its way. The journey continues, written not in cold stone, but in the tenacious and vibrant pulsation of life itself.